My parents insisted it was just helping family, but I saw the truth. It was blackmail wrapped in filial duty. They believed I was still the obedient daughter who would silently accept their ultimatum. They had no idea that the moment they threatened to raise my rent unless I became my sister's unpaid nanny, I held the power to flip the board. They thought the house was their weapon, but their financial future was already in my hands. My name is Harper Rhodes. I am 32 years old, and for the last 5 years, I have made my living calculating the precise likelihood of disaster. As a risk analyst for Harborstone Analytics, my days are spent staring at spreadsheets, predicting market volatility, and advising corporate clients on how to avoid the kind of catastrophes that destroy quarterly earnings. I am good at spotting variables that do not add up. I am good at seeing the crash before it happens. Yet, as I sat at my desk that Tuesday afternoon, staring at the email notification on my phone, I failed to predict the ambush waiting for me in the suburbs of Maplebridge, Ohio. The subject line was brief, lacking the usual passive-aggressive pleasantries my mother preferred. It read simply, "Family meeting, mandatory." The body of the email was even shorter. "Do not be late. No excuses." I drove to Maplebridge with a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The house my parents owned was a sprawling colonial that looked like it had been ripped straight out of a catalog for the American dream. The lawn was manicured to a terrified green submission. The white siding gleamed. In the driveway, my father's sedan was parked at a perfect 90-degree angle. To an outsider, this place screamed stability and warmth. To me, it felt like a museum where I was allowed to visit but never touch the exhibits. When I walked through the front door, the air smelled of lemon polish and unresolved tension. I hung my coat in the foyer, my eyes scanning the gallery wall that lined the staircase. It was a shrine to the Rhodes family legacy, or rather, a shrine to my sister. There were photos of Madeline at prom, Madeline graduating high school, Madeline's wedding day, Madeline holding her firstborn. I was there, of course, but usually in the background, slightly out of focus, or standing on the edge of the frame like an accidental photobomber in my own life. I found them in the living room. The setting was so staged it felt theatrical. My father, Ray Rhodes, was pacing the length of the Persian rug, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked like a general preparing to deliver bad news to the troops. My mother, Linda, sat on the floral armchair with her back so straight she looked like she had swallowed a ruler. And then there was Madeline. My older sister was curled up on the love seat, twisting her diamond wedding band around her finger, over and over. She looked pale and refused to meet my eyes when I entered the room. I sat on the ottoman, the only seat that did not feel claimed by someone else. "I'm here," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Is everyone okay?" My mother exhaled a long, dramatic sigh, the kind that was meant to signal she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders since dawn. "Your sister is exhausted." "Harper," Mom began, her voice soft but laced with that familiar steel edge. "She is drowning. 3 children under the age of 6. It is too much for one person." I looked at Madeline. She offered a weak, watery smile but said nothing. I felt a twinge of sympathy. But my analyst brain kicked in. Madeline had chosen to have 3 children. Madeline had a husband. Madeline had made these choices. "I know it's hard," I said carefully. "Has Grant been able to help more after work?" "Grant works long hours," my father snapped, stopping his pacing to glare at me. "He is building a future for his family." "And that is why we are here," Mom interrupted, leaning forward. "We have come up with a solution, a schedule. Family must sacrifice for family. Harper, it is what we do." She reached onto the coffee table and picked up a laminated sheet of paper, sliding it across the glass surface toward me. I looked down. It was a color-coded calendar. "What is this?" I asked. "It is a help schedule," Mom said. "We need you to step up, starting next week. We need you to pick up Noah and Zoe from school at 3 in the afternoon. You will bring them to Madeline's house, watch the baby, Milo, while Madeline rests, and get dinner started. You will need to stay until Grant gets home around 7. We also need you to take the kids for 2 full weekends a month so Madeline and Grant can work on their marriage." I stared at the paper. The blocks of time were colored in bright, cheerful yellow, as if they were inviting. I did the math in my head instantly. 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, plus 2 full weekends. That was roughly 40 hours of labor a week. A second full-time job. "Mom," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I have a job. A real job. I work until 6 most nights. I have deadlines. I have reports for Harborstone that cannot wait until I have cooked a casserole for Madeline." "You can work remotely," Mom dismissed, waving her hand as if my career were a hobby I indulged in. "You are smart. You will figure it out. Bring your laptop to Madeline's." "I can't analyze risk profiles while chasing a toddler and helping a first grader with homework," I said, my tone hardening. "I am happy to help out occasionally, like I always do, but this is a part-time nanny position. Actually, it is a full-time one." "It is not a position," Dad said, his voice booming. "It is duty." "I can't do it," I said firmly. "I am sorry, Madeline, but I can't. I have my own life. I have my own bills." The room went silent. The air pressure seemed to drop. My father stopped pacing and stood directly behind my mother's chair, presenting a united front. This was the moment. The trap was about to spring. "We thought you might say that," Dad said. His voice had lost its bluster and had gone cold, businesslike. It was the tone he used when he was negotiating a deal he knew he would win. "You talk about your bills. Let us talk about your biggest bill, your rent." I froze. I lived in a duplex on the west side of town, a building my parents had owned for 15 years. When I moved in 4 years ago, they had offered me a discounted rate. It was $800 a month, a steal for the area. They told me constantly, a favor, a gift. "What about my rent?" I asked. "We have been subsidizing your lifestyle for years," Mom said, her voice dripping with disappointed benevolence. "We gave you that apartment for $800 because you are our daughter, because we thought you were a team player. But if you are going to act like a stranger, if you are going to refuse to help this family when we are in crisis, then perhaps we should treat you like a stranger." "We have looked at the market rates," Dad continued, pulling a second sheet of paper from his pocket. "Apartments of that size in that neighborhood are going for $1,800 a month, minimum." $1,800. That was a $1,000 increase. It would wipe out my savings. It would make it impossible to pay my student loans and eat in the same month. "You are threatening me," I said. It wasn't a question. "We are adjusting our arrangement," Mom corrected, smoothing her skirt. "If you cannot find the time to help your sister, then you clearly have enough time to work harder to pay fair market rent. It is your choice. Harper, you can step up and be the aunt and daughter we raised you to be, or you can pay the full price of independence." I looked at Madeline. She was studying her cuticles, refusing to witness the extortion happening 3 feet away from her. She knew. She had signed off on this. They had all discussed it before I walked in the door. The ambush was total. A cold sensation washed over me. It wasn't panic. Panic is hot and frantic. This was clarity. It was the icy detachment of a risk analyst realizing that the data set had changed completely. For years, I thought that apartment was my sanctuary. I thought the low rent was an act of love, a way for them to help me build my life. Now I saw it for what it truly was. It was a leash. They had kept it loose while I was compliant, but the moment I tried to walk away, they were yanking it tight enough to choke me. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg, to negotiate, to apologize for being selfish. They expected the Harper of 10 years ago, the girl who just wanted everyone to be happy. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I took a slow breath, inhaling the lemon polish and the hypocrisy. My mind raced back to a file I had seen 3 weeks ago, a file in my own banking portal that I had opened by mistake, which led me down a rabbit hole of property records I was never meant to see. I thought about the document I had found in the dusty box of my grandmother's effects, a document my parents likely assumed was lost or irrelevant. They were threatening to raise the rent on a property they thought they held absolute power over. They were threatening to squeeze me financially to force me into servitude. I looked at my father, who was watching me with a smug expectation of victory. I looked at my mother, who wore a mask of tragic necessity. "I need time to think," I said. My voice was quiet. "We need an answer today," Dad said, checking his watch. "The first of the month is next week. We need to know if we are sending you a new lease or a schedule for the kids." "You want an answer now?" I asked. "Now," Mom said. I looked down at my hands. If I fought them now, right here in this living room, I would lose. I needed to get to my files. I needed to talk to a lawyer. I needed to confirm that the nuclear option I had sitting in the back of my mind was actually viable. "Okay," I said. "Okay what?" Dad pressed. "Okay, I will do it," I lied. "I will do the schedule. Just send me the details. I will start next week." Mom clapped her hands together, her face breaking into a radiant, triumphant smile. "Oh, Harper, I knew you would do the right thing. I knew you loved your sister." "Thank you, Harper," Madeline whispered, finally looking up with relief washing over her face. "You have no idea how much this helps." "I am sure it does," I said. I stood up, my legs feeling steady, my heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I grabbed my purse. "I have to go," I said. "I have to move some things around at work to make this happen." "Of course, dear," Mom said, standing up to hug me. Her embrace was suffocating, a perfume-scented cage. "We are so proud of you." I walked out of the house, down the perfect walkway, and got into my car. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat in the driver's seat and stared at the front door of the house that had just become a battlefield. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured free childcare and reasserted their dominance. They thought I was the same Harper they had always known. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway. As I drove away from the manicured lawn and the fake warmth, I wasn't thinking about pickup times or diaper changes. I was thinking about the lease agreement sitting in my filing cabinet at home. I was thinking about the clause regarding rent increases that required 90 days of written notice, a law they had just ignored. But more importantly, I was thinking about the names on the deed to the building I lived in. They thought the house was their weapon. They had no idea that I had already found the safety on their gun, and I was about to dismantle it, piece by piece. My name is Harper Rhodes, and for the better part of 3 decades, I have been the invisible scaffolding holding up a facade that was never built to protect me. As I drove away from my parents' pristine suburban driveway, the silence in my car felt heavy. Not with peace, but with the crushing weight of memory. The ultimatum they had just delivered was not a sudden deviation from their character. It was the inevitable crescendo of a symphony they had been composing since I was old enough to tie my own shoes. To the outside world, the Rhodes family was a masterpiece of American domesticity. We were the family on the Christmas card that arrived in your mailbox every December without fail. In those photos, we wore color-coordinated sweaters in shades of burgundy and cream. My father, Ray, would have his hand on my mother's shoulder, projecting strength and stability. My mother, Linda, would be smiling that practiced, beatific smile that suggested her life was a continuous loop of baking cookies and arranging flowers, and in the center, always in the center, was Madeline. The lighting was always arranged to catch the gold in her hair. I was there too. Of course, I was the dark-haired figure on the periphery, the one whose smile looked polite rather than radiant, the one who blended into the background like a piece of necessary but unremarked furniture. Madeline was the sun, and the rest of us were merely planets condemned to orbit her gravitational pull. She was the star who burned too bright and too fast, and my parents loved her for it. When she dropped out of college during her sophomore year, because she felt the curriculum was stifling her creativity, my parents did not lecture her on commitment. They nodded sympathetically and told the neighbors that Madeline was taking time to find her true north. When she racked up $15,000 in credit card debt, funding a jewelry-making business that produced 0 sales, they quietly liquidated a bond to cover it, calling it an investment in her entrepreneurial spirit. I on the other hand, was the control group in their experiment of favoritism. I was the child who was described as sensible. I was the low-maintenance model. I kept my grades perfect, not because I wanted praise, but because I learned early on that causing a problem meant stealing attention from Madeline's latest crisis, and that was a cardinal sin in the Rhodes household. I remember asking for a violin when I was 12. I had saved my allowance for months to pay for half of it. My mother had sighed, looking at me with weary eyes, and told me that money was tight because they had just paid for Madeline's modeling portfolio. She told me that the family had already sacrificed so much for my sister, and surely I could understand that we could not stretch ourselves any thinner. I understood. I always understood. I put the money in a jar and stopped asking. The trap of the apartment was set 4 years ago, though I was too naive to see the teeth of the mechanism at the time. I had just landed my junior analyst position, and I was looking for a place closer to the city. My father had called me, his voice warm and jovial, offering me the unit in the duplex they owned on the west side of Maplebridge. He framed it as a reward for my hard work. He said the rent would be $800, which was significantly below the market rate. He called it a family discount. He called it love. I accepted, thinking it was a launch pad for my independence. Instead, it was an anchor. The low rent came with invisible clauses that were never written in ink but were carved in stone, because they were doing me a favor. I lost the right to say no. It started small. Can you pick up milk on your way home? Can you drive Mom to her dermatologist appointment because Dad is golfing? Can you go over to Madeline's and help her organize her garage because she is feeling overwhelmed? I said yes to everything. I said yes because I believed that this was the currency of gratitude. I believed I was paying them back for their generosity. The illusion shattered on a humid afternoon last July. My parents were hosting a barbecue for their country club friends. I was in the kitchen, slicing lemons for the iced tea, when I heard my father's voice drifting in through the open patio window. He was talking to Mr. Henderson, bragging about their real estate holdings. Mr. Henderson had asked if it was difficult managing the duplex with a tenant. I froze, the knife hovering over a lemon, as I heard my mother chime in. She laughed, a sharp, tinkling sound. She said that it was actually the best arrangement they could hope for. She said that having a capable daughter in the unit was incredibly convenient. She told him that between the maintenance I did myself and the errands I ran for them, I saved them a fortune on hiring a personal assistant or a handyman. She said I was the most cost-effective investment they had ever made. I put the knife down. I didn't scream. I didn't storm out. I finished slicing the lemons, arranged them on a platter, and carried them outside with a smile that felt like it was stapled to my face. But inside, something vital had disconnected. They didn't see me as a daughter to be nurtured. They saw me as an asset to be leveraged. That night, a memory I had suppressed for years clawed its way to the surface. It was of my grandmother, my mother's mother. She was a woman of sharp tongue and steel spine, the only person who ever looked at Madeline with skepticism rather than adoration. 2 weeks before she passed away, she had pulled me close to her hospital bed. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into my forearm. She had whispered that I needed to learn how to stand on my own ground. She told me to never let anyone use the word family as a rope to tie my hands. She said that love should liberate you, not hold you hostage. At 22, I had thought she was speaking in the vague platitudes of the dying. Now, at 32, I realized she was giving me a survival guide. After she died, I had helped my mother clear out her estate. There had been boxes of paperwork, old deeds, and trust documents. I remembered seeing a photocopy of a document that looked like a property transfer or a trust amendment. My name had been on it, typed in an old typewriter font, but the copy was blurred, the edges cut off. I had asked my mother about it. She had snatched the paper from my hand, crumpling it instantly, and told me it was just an old draft of a will that had never been executed. She threw it in the shredder before I could read the paragraph below my name. I had let it go. I trusted them then. I did not trust them now. As my career at Harborstone Analytics advanced, I began to assert small boundaries. I started saying no. I told them I could not watch my niece and nephews on nights when I had quarterly reviews. I stopped answering the phone during business hours. Their reaction was not explosive anger. That would have been too honest. Instead, they deployed the weapon of passive aggression. They gave me the silent treatment. They made vague allusions at Sunday dinners about how money changes people, about how some children forget where they came from. When Madeline's husband, Grant, lost his bonus last year, the pressure on me intensified. They did not ask Grant to pick up a second job. They did not ask Madeline to cut back on her organic grocery deliveries. They looked at me. They looked at my stable salary and my single status, and they decided that my resources were actually community property. They would call me, weeping, saying Madeline was near a breakdown, implying that if I did not step in to clean her house or pay for her car repair, her collapse would be on my conscience. This afternoon in the living room was not a new event. It was not a sudden lapse in judgment. It was the final evolution of a system designed to extract every ounce of value from me to fuel the engine of Madeline's comfort. They called me strong, but I realize now that they only complimented my strength so they could test how much weight I could carry before I broke. They thought I was a structural column that would never move. I pulled my car into the parking lot of the duplex. The building was a brick structure from the 1920s, solid and unpretentious. I looked up at the windows of my apartment. For 4 years, I had walked through that door feeling grateful for their charity. Tonight, I walked toward it feeling like an investigator arriving at a crime scene. I unlocked my door and went straight to the filing cabinet in my home office. I ignored the shaking of my hands. I pulled out the lease agreement. I pulled out the bank statements I had downloaded after the barbecue incident, the ones that showed the odd transfers, and then I reached for the small, metal lockbox I kept hidden in the back of my closet. Inside was the one thing I had managed to salvage from the shredder pile at my grandmother's house, not the document my mother destroyed, but a separate letter my grandmother had left for me, tucked inside a recipe book. It didn't contain legal language, but it contained a reference number for a file held at a law firm in the city. My parents thought they were tightening the noose today. They thought they were forcing the obedient, sensible Harper back into line. They did not understand that by threatening my home, they had inadvertently freed me from the guilt that had kept me docile. The good daughter had died in that living room the moment my father mentioned market rates. The woman who returned to this apartment was someone else entirely. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and began to type. The timeline of their manipulation was long, but my memory was longer, and unlike Madeline, I paid my debts, every single one of them. The silence of my apartment usually brought me comfort, but tonight it vibrated with the kinetic energy of a war room. I sat on the floor, surrounded by a paper trail that spanned 4 years of tenancy and 32 years of deception. The emotional bruising from the afternoon's ambush had faded, replaced by the cold, sharp clarity of my profession. I was no longer the hurt daughter. I was the analyst, and I was looking for the flaw in the system. I started with the lease. My parents, in their arrogance, had likely assumed I never read it. They treated contracts like family suggestions, guidelines to be ignored when convenient, but I had read it. I pulled the document from its plastic sleeve, the paper crisp under my fingers. Clause 4, Section B, rent adjustments. The language was standard boilerplate, likely downloaded from a legal template site, but it was binding. Any increase in the monthly rental amount shall not exceed 5% of the current rate per annum and must be communicated to the tenant via certified mail no less than 90 days prior to the effective date. I did the math. A 5% increase on $800 was $40. They were demanding a $1,000 hike, effective in 7 days, communicated verbally in a living room ambush. Legally, their demand was not just invalid, it was laughable, but legality was a shield, and I needed a sword. I turned to my banking records. 3 weeks ago, while setting up an automatic transfer for my savings, I had noticed a recurring deposit from my parents' account into a holding account labeled Rhodes Property Management, which then immediately routed funds to a creditor I didn't recognize. The memo line on one of the transfers read, "Bridge loan int, urgent. Bridge loans are high interest, short-term financing tools used by desperate people trying to span a gap between debt and liquidity. Why would my parents, who boasted about their financial prudence, need a bridge loan on a property they claim to own outright? I logged into the county auditor's website. Public records are the great equalizer. They do not care about family narratives. I searched for the parcel number of the duplex. The deed history popped up, a digital list of transactions going back decades. There it was. The owner of record wasn't just Raymond and Linda Rhodes. It was the Rhodes Family Trust, with remainder interest too. I squinted at the screen. The text was truncated in the summary view. I paid the $20 fee to download the full PDF of the original deed transfer from 5 years ago, the year my grandmother died. When the document loaded, my breath hitched. The property had been transferred into a trust by my grandmother, Eleanor. My parents were the trustees. Yes, they had the right to manage the property and collect income during their lifetime, but the beneficiary structure was complex. It listed my parents as primary beneficiaries, but under the section titled Contingent Beneficiaries and Rights of Residence, there was a name that stopped my heart. Harper Elizabeth Rhodes. My grandmother hadn't just left the building to them. She had included a clause stating that I was a 10% beneficial owner of the trust assets immediately upon her death, a fact that entitled me to a share of the income and, crucially, protected my right to reside in the property under reasonable terms, determined by the trust's original intent, which was to support the family, not exploit them. My parents had effectively been charging me rent to live in a building I partially owned. They had hidden the trust document, likely relying on the fact that I was too young and too trusting to audit the estate settlement. They were using my own asset as a carrot and a stick to force me into unpaid labor. I needed verification. I needed someone who could look at this mess and tell me if I was seeing a weapon or just a mirage. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 2 years. "Caleb," I said when he answered on the third ring. "Harper?" Caleb Rio sounded surprised. "It has been a while. Everything okay?" "I need a lawyer," I said. "Not a friend. I need you to look at some property records. Tonight." 40 minutes later, I was sitting in the conference room of Rios and Alderstone. Caleb was a real estate attorney who looked at contracts the way a surgeon looks at x-rays, dispassionately and thoroughly. He spread the papers out on the mahogany table, his eyes scanning the dense legal text of the trust deed and the mortgage records I had pulled. "This is messy," Caleb said, leaning back in his chair. "Your parents are playing a dangerous game. Harper." "Tell me," I said. "First, the rent increase," he said, tapping the lease. "It is illegal, unenforceable. If they try to evict you for not paying the new rate, any judge in Maplebridge would throw the case out and likely sanction them for bad faith." "I figured that," I said. "What about the trust?" "That is the interesting part," Caleb said. He pulled the deed closer. "Your grandmother was smart. She didn't trust your parents to play fair. This 10% interest you have? It is real. It means they owe you a fiduciary duty. By charging you rent and threatening to hike it above market value to coerce labor, they are breaching that duty. You could sue them for an accounting of all the rent you have paid over the last 4 years. You could likely demand it all back." "I don't just want the money back," I said. "I want to stop them. Look at the mortgage." Caleb flipped to the financial documents I had uncovered. He frowned. "This is what worries me. They took out a second mortgage on the building 3 years ago, variable rate, and this bridge loan you found? That suggests they are struggling to make the payments on the primary mortgage. The bridge loan is likely covering the interest on the second mortgage. It is a house of cards. Harper, if they miss a payment on the bridge loan, the whole thing collapses." "So they are broke?" I asked, the realization settling in. The pressure to make me a nanny wasn't just about convenience. It was about saving money because they literally didn't have it. Madeline's unpaid labor was a budget line item they needed to balance their sinking ship. "They are cash poor and over-leveraged," Caleb corrected, "and the bank holding the note, Maplebridge Community Bank, is known for being aggressive with distressed assets. If your parents default, the bank will foreclose. They will sell the building to the highest bidder to recoup their loss." And if they foreclose, I said, my mind racing, what happens to the trust? The trust loses the asset, Caleb said. Your 10% vanishes. Your parents lose the income. Everyone loses. I stared at the paperwork. My parents were drowning, and instead of asking for a life raft, they had tried to stand on my shoulders to keep their heads above water. They were willing to exploit me to save themselves, all while lying to my face about family values. An idea began to form in the back of my mind. It was cold and sharp and dangerous. It was the kind of high-risk, high-reward strategy I would never recommend to a client, but for myself, it felt like the only way out. Caleb, I said, leaning forward, who owns the debt? Maplebridge Community Bank, he repeated. Why? Banks hate bad debt, I said. They hate foreclosing on family homes because it is bad PR. They just want their money, or they want the asset off their books. Harper, Caleb warned, seeing the look in my eye. What are you thinking? My parents are a credit risk, I said. Their payments are late. They have a bridge loan. They are toxic borrowers. If I approach the bank, if I offer to buy the debt. You want to buy the mortgage? Caleb asked, incredulous. That is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not the whole building, I said. The debt. Distressed debt sells for pennies on the dollar sometimes. Or at least, banks are willing to restructure if they think a new borrower is more stable. I have excellent credit. I have savings. I have my grandmother's inheritance that I never touched. You want to become your parents' lender, Caleb said slowly. They use this house to control me, I said. They threaten to price me out of my home. If I own the debt, I own the leverage. They would have to pay me, and if they can't, then you can foreclose, Caleb finished. You could take the building. I don't want to take it, I said. I want to secure it. I want to make sure they can never threaten me with it again. And I want to make sure the tenants, including me, aren't victims of their mismanagement. Caleb looked at me for a long moment. He saw the shift. He saw that the daughter who had been pushed around was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the brutal arithmetic of power. It is aggressive, Caleb said. It is complicated, but it is possible. I know the vice president of commercial lending at Maplebridge Community. They are looking to offload risky portfolios before the quarter ends. If we present this right, that you are a partial owner stepping in to stabilize the asset, they might listen. Set up the meeting, I said. And what about your parents? Caleb asked. What do you tell them? I tell them nothing, I said, gathering the papers and sliding them back into my folder. I tell them I need time to think about their offer. I play the part of the confused, overwhelmed daughter a little longer. Let them think they have me cornered. Let them think the silence is hesitation, not preparation. I stood up, feeling a strange surge of adrenaline. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to their narrative. I was writing my own. Draft a letter acknowledging their rent increase notice, but stating I need 30 days to arrange my finances. That buys us time to talk to the bank. And Caleb? Yeah? Make sure the letter is polite, I said, a small, cold smile touching my lips. I want them to feel comfortable. I want them to sleep soundly tonight, thinking they have won. Because when they wake up, the roof over their heads is going to belong to me. The weekend that followed the ultimatum was not spent in tears or panic. It was spent in a state of hyper-focused calculation. I turned my living room into a command center. My laptop was open to 3 different spreadsheets, each one a different scenario for my financial future. I ran the numbers for staying and paying the extortionate rent increase. I ran the numbers for becoming the unpaid nanny my mother wanted, and then I ran the numbers for the nuclear option. The math was brutal, but it was honest. Staying would cost me my dignity and my savings. Leaving would cost me my relationship with my parents, but it would buy back my life. I started looking for apartments on Saturday morning. I filtered my search criteria aggressively. I wanted nothing that resembled the suburban, suffocating charm of Maplebridge's residential districts. No manicured lawns, no nosy neighbors who knew my mother, no family-friendly duplexes. I found a listing for a converted industrial building down by the riverfront. an area that had recently been rezoned for mixed-use development. It was called the Foundry. I toured it on Sunday afternoon. The unit was on the 4th floor. It had exposed brick walls, polished concrete floors, and large steel-framed windows that looked out over the gray, churning water of the Maple Bridge River. The property manager was a woman named Sarah, who wore a sharp blazer and spoke in clear contractual terms. She did not ask who my parents were. She did not ask why a single woman needed a 2-bedroom loft. She just asked for my proof of income and a credit check. "The rent is $2,000 a month," Sarah said. It was $200 more than what my parents were threatening to charge me. But the difference was that this money bought me silence. It bought me a key that my father did not have a copy of. "I will take it," I said. "Can I move in on Wednesday?" "If the check clears and the background check passes, the keys are yours," she replied. I signed the lease electronically that evening. I paid the deposit and the first month's rent from a private investment account I had opened 3 years ago, an account my parents did not know existed. I did not transfer money from my main checking account, just in case my mother was still snooping on my statements. On Monday morning, I requested 3 days of personal leave from Harborstone Analytics. My boss, a man who respected efficiency above all else, approved it without question. Then, I called a moving company based in the next county over. I didn't want to use the local movers in Maplebridge. Everyone talked in this town, and I needed my exit to be a phantom operation. I booked the white glove service for Wednesday morning. They would pack, load, and move everything in 6 hours. While I was orchestrating my physical exit, Caleb was engineering my financial entrance. We met on Tuesday morning at a coffee shop 3 blocks away from Maplebridge Community Bank. Caleb looked tired, but energized, the look of a lawyer who was about to try something unprecedented. I spoke with the asset manager, a guy named Mr. Vance, Caleb said, keeping his voice low. "He knows the property. He knows your parents. He was actually the loan officer who approved their bridge loan 6 months ago." "And?" I asked, gripping my coffee cup. "And he is nervous," Caleb said. "Your parents have missed the payment deadline twice in the last 4 months. They paid the late fees. But for a bank, that is a red flag. They are technically in pre-default status. The bank doesn't want to foreclose because the legal fees are a nightmare and the optics of evicting a nice older couple are terrible. But they also don't want a bad asset on their books. So they are listening," I said. "They are listening," Caleb confirmed. "But here is the reality. Harper, the total debt on the building, between the primary mortgage and the bridge loan, is nearly $450,000. You don't have that kind of cash." "I know," I said. "I have $120,000 in liquid savings in my investment portfolio. I can leverage that." "It is not enough to buy the note outright," Caleb said. "I don't need to buy the whole note," I said. I had spent the weekend refining the strategy. "I want to propose a participation agreement. I will buy the controlling interest in the debt. I put up my $100,000 to buy the riskiest portion of the loan, the bridge loan and a slice of the mortgage. In exchange, the bank assigns me the servicing rights. I become the entity that collects the payments. I become the entity that decides whether to foreclose." Caleb whistled softly. "You want to be the junior lender with senior enforcement rights. You are taking the risk off the bank's plate. If your parents default, you are the one who has to deal with the fallout, not the bank. The bank gets an injection of cash and keeps the secured, safer part of the loan." "Exactly," I said. "Mr. Vance gets to clean up his balance sheet before the quarter ends. He can mark the asset as performing again because I am effectively guaranteeing the payments. He looks like a hero. I get control." "It is risky for you," Caleb warned. "If the building value tanks, you lose your $100,000 first." "The building isn't the asset I care about," I said. "The asset is my freedom, and the leverage is the only thing that matters." We went into the meeting with Mr. Vance at 10 in the morning. I wore my best charcoal suit. I presented my portfolio, my credit score of 815, and my employment history. I spoke the language of risk mitigation. I didn't mention that the borrowers were my parents. I referred to them only as the current obligors. Mr. Vance was a man who looked like he hadn't slept well in months. When I laid out the structure, cash up front to purchase the bridge loan notes and a participation in the mortgage, I saw the tension leave his shoulders. You understand that if you take this position, you are bound by the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act? Mr. Vance asked, peering at me over his glasses. You cannot harass the borrowers. I have no intention of harassment, I said smoothly. I intend to manage the asset professionally, more professionally than it is being managed now. We will need to run this by legal, Mr. Vance said, but he was already reaching for his pen. But given the credit profile of the current borrowers, I think the board will see this as a favorable de-risking move. I spent the next 2 hours signing non-disclosure agreements and preliminary purchase commitments. My hand did not shake. By the time I walked out into the bright sunlight of the parking lot, I felt lighter. I had just signed away a decade of savings, but I had bought a seat at the head of the table. Wednesday was moving day. The movers arrived at 8 in the morning. They were efficient, silent men who treated my life like Tetris blocks. I watched them wrap my books, my clothes, my kitchenware. As the shelves emptied, I felt a strange sensation. It wasn't sadness. It was the feeling of a diver cutting away weight so she could surface. I came to the realization that I didn't actually own much in this apartment. The furniture was mostly hand-me-downs from my parents. A sofa my mother didn't want anymore, a dining table that was scratched. I told the movers to leave the big furniture behind. Take the books, the clothes, the electronics, and the kitchen gear, I instructed. Leave the rest. I wasn't going to take their charity with me. While the movers loaded the truck, I sat on the bare floor of the living room and wrote the letter. It was the only communication I would leave. I didn't write a note explaining my feelings. I didn't write a tearful goodbye. I pulled out a standard lease termination form I had downloaded. To Raymond and Linda Rhodes, landlords. From Harper Rhodes, tenant. Notice of lease termination. Pursuant to the terms of our lease agreement dated 4 years ago, I am providing formal notice of my intent to vacate the premises. As the lease has converted to a month-to-month arrangement, this letter serves as my 30-day notice. However, given the immediate and uninhabitable nature of the hostile negotiation attempted on Sunday, I have vacated the property effective immediately. The keys are on the counter. Please direct all future correspondence regarding the security deposit to my attorney, Caleb Rios. I signed it. I drove to the post office and sent it via certified mail. Return receipt requested. They would have to sign for it. They would have to acknowledge legally that I was gone. I returned to the apartment for one final sweep. It was hollow now. The afternoon sun slanted across the dust motes dancing in the air. I walked into the kitchen and placed the 2 silver keys on the granite countertop. They made a sharp metallic clatter that echoed in the empty space. I took my phone out and snapped a single picture. It captured the keys, the empty counter, and the blank wall behind it where a photo of me and Madeline used to hang. I didn't take the photo for sentimental reasons. I took it for evidence. If they tried to claim I damaged the property or didn't return the keys, I had the time-stamped proof. I walked out the door and locked it from the inside handle before pulling it shut. The click of the latch was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I drove across town to the River District. The foundry rose up against the skyline, red brick and black steel. It looked nothing like the soft, pastel world I had left behind. It looked strong. It looked like a fortress. The movers had already unloaded my boxes into the center of the concrete floor. The space smelled of fresh paint and river water. I stood in the center of my new living room, surrounded by cardboard towers. It was chaotic, but it was my chaos. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was an email from Caleb. Subject: Update on transaction. Harper. Maple Bridge Community Bank has formally approved the sale of the debt tranche. We are scheduled to close the transfer of the lien on Friday. As of Monday morning, you will be the servicer of record for the Rhodes property mortgage. Congratulations, you just bought the bank. I lowered the phone and looked out the massive industrial window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the water. My parents were probably just now driving over to my old apartment, perhaps to check on me or to pressure me for an answer about the nanny schedule. They would find the door locked. They would use their master key. They would walk into the silence of an empty house. They would be furious. They would feel abandoned. They would start calling my phone, which was already set to silent. But they didn't know the real storm was coming. They thought they had lost a tenant and a free babysitter. They had no idea that the nobody daughter they had tried to erase was about to become the person they had to write a check to on the first of every month. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the cool air of the loft. I wasn't just Harper the daughter anymore. I was Harper the creditor, and collection day was coming. The electronic silence I had purchased with my first month's rent at the foundry did not last long. My phone began to vibrate on the concrete kitchen island, just 20 minutes after I had taken that final photo of the keys. It buzzed and danced across the surface like an angry insect. The screen flashed Mom repeatedly, then Dad, then the landline from the house. I let it ring for an hour. I poured a glass of wine, unpacked my kettle, and watched the river churn outside my window. I needed to let their initial shock transmute into the specific frequency of rage I was prepared to handle. When the phone lit up with my mother's name for the 15th time, I finally swiped the green icon and put it on speaker. Harper Elizabeth Rhodes. My mother's voice was a sonic weapon, distorted by hysteria and poor reception. Where are you? The apartment is empty. Why are the keys on the counter? I moved out, I said, my voice steady, cutting through her noise like a scalpel. I sent you a certified letter. You should receive it tomorrow. You moved out? My father's voice roared from the background. He must have snatched the phone. Who gave you permission to move out? We were in the middle of a discussion. We had a deal pending. We did not have a deal, I corrected him. You gave me an ultimatum. You said pay market rate or become a nanny. I chose a third option. I vacated the property. The lease allows for termination on a month-to-month basis. I followed the contract. Contract? My mother was back on the line, sounding breathless, as if she had been physically struck. We are your parents. Harper, you do not talk to us about contracts. You do not just abandon your family because we asked for a little help. This is a betrayal. After everything we have done for you, the cheap rent, the support. I paid $800 a month for 4 years, I said. That is $38,400. I was not a charity case. I was a tenant. And as for the support, I think we both know that transaction has been going one way for a long time. You are ungrateful, my father spat. You are a selfish, cold-hearted little... I have fulfilled my legal obligations, I interrupted, refusing to let the insult land. If you want to discuss the security deposit, you can speak to my lawyer. Goodbye. I ended the call and blocked the number for the night. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a physical betrayal of my calm exterior. But I forced myself to take a sip of wine. They were not hurt because they missed me. They were hurt because they had lost control. The next morning, the strategy shifted. Since they could not reach me, they deployed the flying monkeys. The flying monkey is a term for the people a narcissist recruits to fight their battles, usually by feeding them a distorted version of reality. In the Rhodes family, the chief flying monkey was often my Aunt Diane. She was my mother's younger sister, a kind but easily swayed woman who hated conflict and just wanted everyone to get along. She called me at 10 in the morning while I was setting up my home office. Harper? Her voice was tentative. Honey, I am so worried. Your mother called me at 6 this morning. She was sobbing. She said you ran away. I did not run away, Diane, I said, putting down a stack of books. I am 32. I moved. She said you might be in trouble. Diane hesitated. She told the cousins that you met a man, some guy who is a bad influence. She said he convinced you to cut them off and that you are refusing to help Madeline with the babies because this man doesn't like children. I almost laughed. It was so predictable. In their narrative, I could not possibly have enough agency to leave them on my own. I had to be brainwashed by a phantom villain. There is no man, Diane, I said firmly. There is only Elise. Then why did you leave like that? She asked. Linda said you just disappeared in the middle of the night to punish them. They told me that unless I agreed to work 40 hours a week as an unpaid nanny for Madeline, they would raise my rent by $1,000 a month. I said. I laid the numbers out plainly. They threatened to make me homeless if I didn't become their servant. That is not love, Diane. That is extortion. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Diane processing this. She knew my parents. She knew their obsession with money and appearance. $1,000? She whispered. Effective immediately, I confirmed. I chose to leave. That is the whole story. Diane faltered. She didn't tell me that part. She just said you were being difficult about babysitting. I am sure she did, I said. You can believe what you want, Diane, but I am safe. I am in a secure building, and I am done being the retirement plan and the help. I believe you, Diane said softly. The tone of her voice shifted from concern to a quiet, sad resignation. I always wondered how long you would take it. I just didn't think they would go that far. 2 days later, the war escalated from the personal to the professional. I was at my desk at Harborstone Analytics when the receptionist messaged me to say a courier had delivered a letter marked Urgent Personnel Matter. It was addressed to my department head, but because our office culture was transparent, he had brought it to me unopened, assuming it was personal correspondence mislabeled. I recognized the handwriting on the envelope immediately. It was my mother's loop-heavy script. I took the letter to Caleb's office that evening. He opened it with a letter opener, reading the contents with a grim expression. To whom it may concern, Caleb read aloud, his voice flat. We are writing to express concern regarding our daughter, Harper Rhodes, an employee of your firm. Recently, Harper has exhibited erratic behavior, abandoning serious familial obligations and financial debts. We worry that her judgment is compromised and that this instability may reflect on her professional duties. We ask that you encourage her to seek counseling and reconcile with those who support her. My stomach turned. It was a clumsily worded attempt to sabotage my career. They wanted to paint me as unstable so that I would lose my job, lose my income, and be forced to crawl back to them. It is libelous, I said, my hands shaking with rage. They are trying to get me fired. It is desperate, Caleb corrected, and it is legally useless. No HR department touches a letter like this from a mommy and daddy. It makes them look crazy, not you. But, Harper, this is gold. How is this gold? I asked. It establishes a pattern of harassment, Caleb said, sliding the letter into a clear plastic evidence bag. If we ever need to prove that their rent increase was part of a larger campaign of coercion, this letter is Exhibit A. Keep it. Do not respond to it. Then came Madeline. My sister called me on a Friday night. I had been in the new apartment for 10 days. I had expected her to call sooner, but she had likely been too busy drowning in the childcare duties I had refused to shoulder. Harper. Her voice was thick with tears. I don't know what to do. The kids are screaming. Grant is working late again. Mom is furious, and she takes it out on me. I am sorry you are having a hard time, Madeline, I said. I felt a twinge of the old guilt, the reflex to jump in my car and go save her, but I stayed seated. Why are you doing this? She sobbed. Why do you have to be so stubborn? Mom says if you just apologize, you can come back. We can work something out. I need you. Harper, I am drowning. I am not doing this to you, I said, my voice hardening. Mom and Dad did this. They tried to sell my time to you without my consent. You knew about the ultimatum. Madeline, you sat on that couch and twisted your ring while they threatened to evict me. I was scared, she stammered. You know how they are? Yes, I do, I said. And because I know how they are, I removed myself from the equation. I am not coming back to be the buffer between you and your choices. Madeline, if you are drowning, tell your husband to come home. Tell Mom to help, but do not call me to fix a life you chose. "You have changed," she whispered. "You are so cold now." "I am not cold," I said. "I am just closed for business." The climax of their initial fury arrived on a rainy Tuesday. I was cooking dinner in my loft when the intercom buzzed. The video screen on the wall flickered to life. I saw them standing in the vestibule of the foundry. My father was wearing his trench coat, looking wet and angry. My mother was clutching her purse like a shield. They had found me. Maple Bridge was not that big, and I hadn't changed my license plate. "Harper," my father's voice crackled through the speaker. "We know you are up there. The doorman said you are in 4B. Let us up. We need to talk face to face." "No," I said, leaning into the microphone. "Don't be ridiculous," my mother snapped, looking up at the camera lens. "Open the door. We brought your mail. We need to settle this nonsense about the lease." "Put the mail in the outgoing slot," I said. "I am not letting you in." "This is your father," Dad shouted, causing the security guard in the background to look up from his desk. "You do not lock us out." "I live here," I said. "This is a secure building. If you do not leave, I will ask security to remove you. If you continue to harass me, I will file for a restraining order. Do not come here again." "You wouldn't dare," Mom hissed. "Try me," I said. "If you want to talk about the lease, you can talk to my lawyer, Caleb Rios. You have his information." I cut the feed. My heart was pounding, but for the first time, I felt physically safe. They could not get to me. The heavy steel door downstairs was a barrier they could not manipulate with guilt or shouting. The mention of a lawyer must have finally registered as a real threat. 2 days later, Caleb called me. "They hired counsel," Caleb said, sounding amused. "Marjorie Kane. She is a strip mall generalist. Mostly does divorces and wills. She sent me a letter threatening to sue you for constructive abandonment and breach of verbal contract regarding the child care." "Is that a real thing?" I asked. "No," Caleb laughed. "It is legal gibberish, but she suggests that before they file a lawsuit, we should attend a formal mediation. She calls it a good faith effort to resolve family discord." "Mediation," I repeated. "They want to sit in a room and bully me with a referee present." "Essentially," Caleb agreed. "Marjorie probably told them it is the best way to get you to crack. They think if they get you in a room, they can guilt you into a settlement, maybe get you to agree to pay some back rent or sign a promissory note." I looked at the file on my desk, the file that contained the purchase agreement for the mortgage debt, which was currently being processed by the bank's back office. The deal was not closed yet, but it was close. "Let's do it," I said. "Harper, you don't have to," Caleb said. "We can tell them to pound sand." "No," I said. "I want to do it. I want them on the record. I want a neutral third party to write down exactly what they demanded. I want their threats documented in an official report." "You want to build a case?" Caleb realized. "I want to let them dig their hole a little deeper," I said. "Set it up. Let's go to mediation. Let them think they are dragging me to the principal's office." "And the mortgage?" Caleb asked. "Do we tell them?" "Not yet," I said. "Let them walk into that room thinking they are the property owners and I am the wayward tenant. It will make the fall so much harder when the ground disappears beneath them." I hung up the phone. Outside, the rain lashed against the industrial windows of the foundry. I imagined my parents sitting in their kitchen, feeling smug that they had forced a meeting. They thought they were reeling me back in. They didn't know I was the one holding the line. The Maple Bridge Mediation Center was designed to be the architectural equivalent of a deep breath. The walls were painted a shade of white so sterile it felt clinical. The carpet was a muted gray that swallowed the sound of footsteps. In the center of the conference room sat a long, oval table made of blonde wood, clearly chosen because it lacked sharp edges. It was a room built to neutralize passion. But as I walked in with Caleb Rios at my side, the air felt heavy with the static electricity of a coming storm. My parents were already seated on the far side of the table. They had positioned themselves like executives at a board meeting. My father, Ray, wore his navy blazer and a tie that I recognized as his church tie. My mother, Linda, was dressed in a soft beige cardigan, her hands clasped tightly around a tissue, ready to deploy tears at a moment's notice. Next to them sat Marjorie Kane, their lawyer. She was a woman with heavily sprayed hair and a suit that was slightly too bright for the solemnity of the occasion. There was an empty chair next to my mother. Madeline was not here. "Her babysitter canceled," my mother said sharply as soon as I looked at the empty seat. "She is busy raising the children you refused to help with." "Good morning to you too, Linda," I said. Pulling out the chair opposite her, I sat down with slow, deliberate movements. I placed my notebook and pen on the table. I did not smile. The mediator, a man named Elias Monroe, cleared his throat. He was a man of indeterminate age with a soothing voice and the patient eyes of someone who had watched people argue over lawn ornaments and inheritances for 20 years. "Welcome, everyone," Mr. Monroe said. "Let us review the ground rules. We are here to find a constructive path forward. We will not interrupt one another. We will not use personal insults. The goal is a practical resolution, not a character assassination. Ray, since you requested this session, would you like to begin?" My father nodded, adjusting his cufflinks. He looked at Mr. Monroe, ignoring me completely. "This whole situation is a misunderstanding," my father began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Our family has always been close. We are currently facing a stressful time with our eldest daughter, Madeline, who is overwhelmed with 3 young children. All we did was ask Harper to step up. We asked for family support, instead of talking to us. Harper ran away in the middle of the night, abandoned her lease, and cut off contact. We are just hurt. We want our daughter back." It was a masterful performance. If I didn't know him, I would have believed he was just a concerned patriarch. Mr. Monroe turned to me. "Harper, how do you respond?" I didn't look at my father. I looked directly at the mediator. "That is a creative retelling of events," I said. My voice was cool, stripped of any emotion. There was no request for support. There was a transactional ultimatum on Tuesday, the 24th of last month, at approximately 6 in the evening. My parents called a mandatory meeting. They presented me with a schedule requiring 40 hours of childcare per week. When I stated that I could not fulfill this due to my full-time employment, they informed me that my rent, which has been $800 for 4 years, would immediately increase to $1,800 unless I complied. I paused to let the numbers hang in the air. "They did not ask for help," I continued. "They attempted to garnish my wages in the form of labor. They leveraged my housing security to coerce me into unpaid servitude. I did not run away. I terminated my tenancy in accordance with the hostile environment they created." "That is a lie." My mother slammed her hand on the table, the tissue fluttering. "We are family. You lived in our building for a fraction of what it is worth. We subsidized your life for years. Is it so wrong to expect a little gratitude in return? To expect you to think of someone other than yourself for once?" "Gratitude is a feeling, Mom," I said, turning to face her. "Rent is a contract. You cannot pay a mortgage with gratitude, and you cannot demand 40 hours of labor in exchange for a discount you offered voluntarily." "You lived on our charity," she shouted, "and the moment we asked for a return on that investment, you hired a shark." She gestured at Caleb. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He looked entirely unbothered by the insult. "Let us discuss the legal reality here," Caleb said, his voice dropping an octave, forcing everyone to lean in to hear him. "The lease agreement Harper signed contains a clause limiting rent increases to 5% annually, with 90 days of written notice. Your demand for a $1,000 increase, which is a 125% hike, effective immediately, was a violation of that contract. Furthermore, conditioning housing on the performance of unpaid labor creates an employment relationship. If Harper had agreed, you would be violating federal labor laws regarding minimum wage and overtime, what you call family support. The Department of Labor calls economic coercion and indentured servitude." Marjorie Kane shifted in her seat. She whispered something to my father, her eyes darting between Caleb and the mediator. She knew Caleb was right. She knew that if this went to a real court, they would be decimated. "Let us not get bogged down in technicalities," Marjorie said, offering a tight, strained smile. "This is fundamentally a dispute about family values. The Rhodes family is simply trying to re-establish a connection. Perhaps the rent increase was stated in the heat of the moment, but surely Harper can acknowledge that her departure was abrupt and damaging to the family dynamic." "My departure was a survival tactic," I said, "and I will not apologize for it." My father's face was turning a mottled shade of red. "We need that apartment filled," he growled. "You left us high and dry. Do you know how hard it is to find a tenant in 2 days? You cost us money, Harper." "I gave you possession of the unit immediately," I countered. "You are free to rent it at market rate to a stranger. Unless, of course, you don't actually want a tenant. You want a hostage." "We needed the money," my mother blurted out. The room went silent. My father froze, his eyes widening as he looked at his wife. Marjorie Kane closed her eyes briefly, as if in pain. "What was that, Mrs. Rhodes?" Mr. Monroe asked gently, his pen hovering over his notepad. "The building," my mother said, her voice trembling. "It is expensive. Repairs, taxes. If Harper isn't there paying rent, or if she isn't helping Madeline so Madeline can go back to work part-time, we don't have the cash flow. We need the rent to pay the debt on the building." I felt a jolt of electricity run through me. There it was, the confession. They weren't just mean. They were desperate. They had admitted, on the record, that their financial stability was hinged on my compliance. Caleb looked at me. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were dancing. This was the confirmation we needed. They were insolvent. They were struggling to service the debt. "So," Caleb said, his voice soft but lethal, "you admit that the ultimatum was driven by your own financial distress? You were attempting to solve your liquidity crisis by extracting value from Harper, either through cash or labor?" "We were trying to keep the family afloat," my mother sobbed, "and she just sat there and let us sink." "I am not your life raft," I said, "and I am certainly not your paddle." Mr. Monroe scribbled furiously in his notebook. "I think we have reached the core of the issue. The demand for childcare was effectively a financial transaction disguised as a familial request. Given the admission of financial strain, it seems clear that the relationship between landlord and tenant has become untenable due to a conflict of interest." "We want her to come back," my father said. Though his voice lacked conviction now, he sounded defeated. We can keep the rent at $800 if she just agrees to watch the boys on weekends." "No," I said. "I am never living in a property you own ever again. I am never signing a contract with you again, and I am certainly not watching Madeline's children as part of a negotiation." "Then what do you want?" Marjorie asked, looking at her watch. "Why are we here?" "I want a clean break," I said. "I want a signed agreement stating that the lease is terminated by mutual consent, with no penalties. I want my full security deposit returned within 7 days. And I want a clause stating that you will cease all harassment, no more calls to my office, no more showing up at my new building, and no more slander to the extended family." "And if we don't sign?" my father asked, trying to summon one last scrap of authority. "Then I sue you for the illegal rent hike attempt, constructive eviction, and the emotional distress caused by your harassment campaign." Caleb answered for me. "And given Mrs. Rhodes's admission just now, I will also subpoena your financial records to prove the economic coercion. I imagine the bank holding your mortgage would be very interested to hear that you are relying on illegal labor practices to make your payments." The color drained from my father's face. The mention of the bank was the kill shot. He knew, and I knew, that they were hanging by a thread with Maple Bridge Community Bank. He couldn't risk a lawsuit drawing attention to their insolvency. "Fine," my father whispered. "Draw it up." The rest of the session was administrative. Mr. Monroe drafted the settlement agreement. It was a humiliating document for them. It explicitly forbade them from contacting me for any purpose other than emergencies. It confirmed that I owed them nothing. It stripped them of the narrative that I was the villain. I watched them as they signed. My mother's hand shook so badly she could barely form the L in Linda. My father signed with a sharp, angry scrawl, pressing so hard the pen nearly tore the paper. They thought this was the end. They thought they were losing a daughter and a tenant, but saving their secrets. They thought that by signing this paper, they were walling me off from their financial mess. They had no idea. As I signed my name below theirs, I felt a strange sense of pity, not enough to stop me, but enough to make me pause. They were so small, so terrified of losing their status, that they would eat their own children to survive. "It is done," Mr. Monroe said, stamping the document. "Copies will be emailed to all parties." My parents stood up. They didn't look at me. They gathered their coats and walked out of the white room, looking older and frailer than they had when they entered. Marjorie Kane gave Caleb a curt nod and followed them. I remained seated for a moment, listening to their footsteps fade down the hallway. "You got what you wanted," Caleb said, closing his briefcase. "You are free." "I got the first half of what I wanted," I corrected him. "You know," Caleb said, "once the debt transfer goes through next week, you technically could have enforced all of this without the mediation." "I know," I said, "but I needed them to put it in writing. I needed them to admit that the building is the only thing keeping them afloat." "Why?" Caleb asked. "Because," I said, standing up and smoothing my skirt, "when I take over the loan, I don't want them to say I stole their house. I want the record to show that they were already losing it. I am not the villain in this story. Caleb, I am just the inevitable consequence of their bad math." We walked out of the mediation center into the cool afternoon air. I checked my phone. There was an email from Mr. Vance at the bank. Subject: Closing documents. Ready for signature. Harper, the paperwork for the debt assignment is ready. Please come by tomorrow morning, by noon. You will be the secured creditor for the Rhodes property. I smiled. My parents had just signed a peace treaty, unaware that the war was already over, and I had won. The morning I bought my parents' debt, the sky over Maple Bridge was a bruised purple, heavy with unfallen rain. It felt appropriate. I was walking into the main branch of Maple Bridge Community Bank not as a customer looking to open a checking account, but as an investor looking to acquire a distressed asset. Mr. Vance was waiting for me in the executive conference room, a space that smelled of stale coffee and expensive carpet. On the table sat a stack of documents 3 inches thick. To the uninitiated, it looked like boring administrative paperwork. To me, it looked like a loaded weapon. "Everything is in order, Ms. Rhodes," Mr. Vance said, sliding the stack toward me. "As discussed, you are purchasing a 60% controlling interest in the existing mortgage note and 100% of the bridge loan facility secured by the property at 424 Oak Street. The bank retains a minority stake, but assigns all servicing and enforcement rights to you." I picked up the pen. It felt heavy in my hand. The math had been agonizing. I had liquidated nearly my entire stock portfolio. I had drained my emergency fund. I had taken out a personal loan against my own future earnings at Harborstone. Every dollar I had saved for a house, a wedding, or a rainy day was now funneled into this signature. I signed, then I signed again, and again. With every stroke of the blue ink, the balance of power in the Rhodes family shifted, tectonic plate by tectonic plate. When I finished, Mr. Vance countersigned and stamped the final page. "Congratulations," he said, though he looked at me with a mixture of respect and mild fear. "You are now the secured creditor of record. The borrowers will be notified that their loan servicing has been transferred to a new entity, HR Holdings LLC. They won't know it is you unless they dig into the state corporate filings." "They won't dig," I said. "They are too busy trying to keep their heads above water to look at who is holding the hose." Walking out of the bank with Caleb, the reality hit me. Technically, my parents still owned the building. Their names were on the deed. They collected the rent, but I owned the mortgage. Every month, when my father sat down to write a check to the bank, that money was effectively flowing into my pocket. If they missed a payment, They weren't answering to a faceless corporate algorithm anymore. They were answering to me. Caleb shook his head as we reached his car, a small laugh escaping him. I have practiced real estate law for 15 years. Harper, I have seen hostile takeovers, bitter divorces, and petty squabbles. But this is a masterpiece. I have never seen a client go from an evicted tenant to the landlord's boss in under 6 weeks. I am not their boss, I said, putting on my sunglasses to hide the fatigue in my eyes. I am just the bank. So, what is the first move, banker? Caleb asked. Do we call in the loan, inspect the property? No, I said. We wait. I want to see if they can swim on their own. If they make the payments and maintain the building, I will stay invisible. I will collect the interest and let them live their lives. But if they slip, I will know. For 2 months, I did exactly that. I became a ghost in my own story. I went to work at Harborstone. I analyzed risk for other people. And at night, I logged into the loan servicing portal I had set up. Month 1. The payment arrived on the 4th, 4 days late, incurring a $50 late fee. Month 2. The payment arrived on the 10th, another late fee. They were struggling. I could see the cracks in the financial foundation just by looking at the timestamps on the transfers. Then, the whispers started reaching me. Maple Bridge is a small town, and disaster has a distinct sound. It travels through the grapevine faster than bad news. I heard from a cousin that Madeline and her husband, Grant, had finally launched their dream project, a high-end organic baby food subscription service. It had crashed and burned within 90 days due to supply chain issues and a complete lack of market research. The rumor was that my parents had poured $20,000 of their own liquidity into saving the business, money they absolutely did not have. The impact on the building was immediate and ugly. It started with a chance encounter at the grocery store on a Tuesday evening. I was in the produce aisle, inspecting avocados, when I saw Mrs. Higgins. She was one of the tenants in my parents' building, a sweet widow in her 70s who had lived in Unit 1A for a decade. She looked frail. Her coat was buttoned all the way up to her chin, even though it was mild inside the store. Harper, she squinted at me. Is that you, dear? Mrs. Higgins, I smiled, maneuvering my cart toward her. It is good to see you. How are you? She sighed, a rattling sound in her chest. Oh, surviving, dear, just surviving. I miss seeing you around the building. It has changed since you left. Changed how? I asked, my analyst radar pinging instantly. Well, she lowered her voice, looking around as if she might be overheard. Your parents, they raised the rent on all of us, told us it was a market adjustment. My rent went up $200. I am on a fixed income. Harper, I don't know how I'm going to manage. $200? I asked. Did they give you 90 days' notice? They gave us a week, she said. They said if we didn't like it, we could leave. But where am I going to go at my age? My grip on the shopping cart handle tightened until my knuckles turned white. They were doing it again. They were running the exact same play they had tried on me, but this time on people who didn't have a law degree or a Caleb Rios to defend them. And that is not the worst of it, Mrs. Higgins continued, shivering slightly. The boiler has been acting up. The radiator in my bedroom hasn't worked in 3 weeks. I called your father, and he said parts are on back order. He told me to buy a space heater. But Harper, the mold in the bathroom, it is getting worse, and he says it is just humidity. I looked at this woman, who had baked me cookies when I moved in, who sent me a card every birthday. She was shivering because her landlord, my father, was too cheap to fix the heat while he funneled cash into my sister's failed business. I am so sorry, Mrs. Higgins, I said, my voice trembling with suppressed rage. You should not have to live like that. It is not your fault, dear. She patted my hand. You are the good one. You got out. I drove home that night with a cold fury burning in my gut. This was no longer just a financial transaction. It was a moral failing. My parents weren't just bad with money. They were bad landlords. They were slumlords. They were sacrificing the health and safety of elderly tenants to prop up their golden child's mistakes. I called Caleb at 8 o'clock. "We have a problem," I said. "Did the check bounce?" Caleb asked. "Worse," I said. "They are deferring maintenance. The heat is out in Unit 1A, there is mold, and they are illegally raising rents on existing tenants to cover their cash flow gaps." "That is a violation of the mortgage covenants," Caleb said instantly. His lawyer voice was sharp. "Standard commercial mortgage clause. The borrower must maintain the property in good repair and comply with all local housing laws. If they are letting the asset deteriorate, they are impairing your collateral." "I know," I said. "The building is the security for the loan. If they let it rot, the value drops, and my investment becomes worthless." "Technically, yes," Caleb said. "But more importantly, it gives you grounds to intervene. You can demand an inspection. You can demand they cure the defects. And if they don't, I can declare the loan in default." I finished the sentence. "I can accelerate the debt. I can foreclose." "Are you ready for that?" Caleb asked quietly. "Foreclosing on your parents? That is the nuclear option. Harper, there is no coming back from that." I looked out my window at the dark river. I thought about Mrs. Higgins shivering in her apartment. I thought about my mother's voice at the mediation, crying about how they needed the money. They were willing to let a 70-year-old woman freeze so they didn't have to admit to Madeline that the bank of Mom and Dad was closed. "They made their choice," I said. "They chose to protect their pride instead of their tenants. I am not going to let them run that building into the ground." "Okay," Caleb said. "What is the plan?" "We don't foreclose yet," I said. "We squeeze. We force them to do the right thing. If they refuse, then we take the keys. But first, we need proof, real proof, not just supermarket gossip." "You want to send an inspector?" Caleb asked. "No," I said. "I want Mrs. Higgins to file a formal complaint with the city, and I want to be the one who helps her fill out the paperwork." The twist wasn't that I was going to take their money. The twist was that I was going to use the very laws they ignored to bring their whole kingdom crashing down. I wasn't just a creditor anymore. I was the enforcement arm of karma. "Draw up a notice of default regarding the maintenance issues," I told Caleb. "Send it to them on Monday. Sign it, HR Holdings LLC. Let's scare them. Let's see if they fix the heat when the bank threatens to take the house." "And if they call the bank screaming?" Caleb asked. "Let them scream," I said. "The bank doesn't answer to them. The bank answers to me." I hung up the phone. I wasn't waiting anymore. The observation period was over. It was time for the intervention. My parents thought they were playing a game of chicken with a faceless institution. They were about to find out that the driver of the oncoming truck was the daughter they thought they had discarded. The rebellion began not with a shout, but with a stack of paperwork filed quietly on a Tuesday morning. After my encounter with Mrs. Higgins in the grocery store, I did not storm over to my parents' house to scream about the mold. Screaming is inefficient. It tips your hand. Instead, I spent the evening in Mrs. Higgins' living room, wearing a mask to filter out the damp, musty air, helping her fill out the tenant complaint form for the Maple Bridge Department of Housing Inspection. She was terrified. She thought my father would evict her if she complained. I held her hand, my skin feeling the trembling of her thin fingers, and assured her that retaliation against a tenant for reporting code violations was illegal. I didn't tell her that I would personally ensure that any attempt to evict her would result in immediate legal warfare. I just told her she had rights. Once her complaint was filed, I went home and submitted my own report anonymously. I attached the photos Mrs. Higgins had let me take, the black spots blooming on the bathroom ceiling, the rusted radiator, and the loose railing on the back porch that swayed dangerously in the wind. The city inspector, a man named Mr. Henderson, who carried a clipboard like a shield, arrived 3 days later. I wasn't there, but Mrs. Higgins gave me the play-by-play. My parents had met him at the curb, all smiles and deflection. My father tried to clap Mr. Henderson on the back. My mother offered him coffee. Mr. Henderson declined both. He walked through the building for 2 hours. He tested every smoke detector. He measured the moisture levels in the drywall. He shook the railings. By the time he left, he had written cited violations for 3 separate units. The fire alarm system was outdated and non-compliant. The water damage in Unit 1A was classified as a health hazard. The rear egress was unstable. He gave them 30 days to cure the defects or face fines of $500 per day. My parents were frantic. They didn't have the cash to fix a leaky faucet, let alone rewire a fire alarm system. They were trapped between the city's demands and their own empty bank accounts. I witnessed the fallout 2 days later at a lunch arranged by my Aunt Diane. She had begged me to come, saying my mother was in a state and needed family. I agreed, mostly because I needed to gauge their psychological condition before I pulled the next lever. We met at a diner halfway between my office and their house. My mother looked like she had aged 5 years in 5 weeks. Her eyes were puffy, and she kept shredding her paper napkin into tiny, snowy piles. "I just don't understand it," Mom said, staring into her untouched iced tea. "It feels like the universe is punishing us. First you leave, then the business with Madeline fails. And now this inspector comes out of nowhere? He was so rude. Harper. He acted like we were criminals." "He was doing his job." "Mom," I said, cutting my sandwich, "those violations are real. Mrs. Higgins could get sick." "Mrs. Higgins is a complainer," Mom snapped, her voice regaining a momentary sharpness. "We have been good to her, and now it feels like someone is orchestrating this. It is too much bad luck all at once. The bank is calling. The city is calling. The tenants are angry. It feels like a conspiracy." She looked at me, her eyes searching for sympathy, for the daughter who used to fix things. I put down my fork. I wiped my mouth. "It is not a conspiracy, Mom," I said calmly. "It is gravity. You cannot strip mine a building to fund Madeline's lifestyle and expect the building to stay standing. You cannot treat tenants like ATMs and expect them not to speak up. No one is setting you up. You are just finally facing the consequences of using other people as shields." "You sound so cold," she whispered, tears welling up. "We are your parents." "And that is the only reason I'm sitting here," I said. "If you were anyone else, I would have reported you myself." I didn't tell her I already had. The pressure cooker exploded the following Monday. Caleb and I drafted a formal letter from the lender. Since I owned the servicing rights, the letterhead still bore the logo of Maple Bridge Community Bank, but the signature line read, "Authorized Servicer for HR Holdings, LLC." The letter was a notice of covenant breach. It stated that the bank was aware of the city code violations. It cited the clause in the mortgage agreement that required the property to be maintained in good condition. It gave them 14 days to provide proof of repairs, or the loan would be placed in default. My father panicked. He didn't have the money for repairs, and he certainly didn't have the money to pay off the loan if it was called in. He tried to pull a Hail Mary. He called an old golfing buddy, a man named Jerry who flipped houses. My father offered to sell Jerry a 40% stake in the building for $50,000, just enough to patch the repairs and pay the mortgage arrears. It was a desperate, bad deal, selling equity for pennies, but he had no choice. Jerry agreed. They drew up a simple contract. My father sent it to the bank for what he thought was a rubber stamp approval. He didn't know the new rules. I rejected the transfer within an hour. The loan agreement, the one I now controlled, had a due on sale clause. It also had a specific provision regarding the transfer of equity. No part of the collateral could be sold or transferred without the express written consent of the senior creditor. And the senior creditor did not want Jerry involved. I didn't want a partner. I wanted compliance. My father was furious. He called the bank, screaming at the poor receptionist. He demanded to speak to the loan officer. He demanded to speak to the manager. He demanded to know why the bank was blocking him from saving his own property. Mr. Vance, playing his part perfectly, told my father that the account was now handled by a special assets group and that he would need to meet with the portfolio manager directly to discuss the rejection. "Fine," my father had shouted. "Set it up. I will come down there and straighten this out." The meeting was set for 3 o'clock on a Thursday. I arrived at the bank early. I sat in the executive conference room, the same room where I had signed the papers to buy their debt. I sat at the head of the table. To my right sat Caleb. To my left sat Mr. Vance, looking uncomfortable but resigned. I wore a navy suit, sharp and tailored. I had my hair pulled back. On the table in front of me was the file, the photos of the mold, the unpaid invoices, the tenant complaints, and the mortgage note. At 3 o'clock exactly, the door opened. My parents walked in. My father was leading. His face flushed with the kind of bluster he used when he was trying to intimidate a waiter. My mother was a step behind him, clutching her purse. "This is ridiculous." My father started speaking before he even looked at the table. "I have been a customer of this bank for 30 years. You cannot just block a sale when I'm trying to—" He stopped. He saw Mr. Vance, then he saw Caleb. And then he saw me. The silence that sucked the air out of the room was absolute. It was a physical weight. I watched his eyes dart from my face to the nameplate on the table, then back to my face. He looked confused, as if his brain was refusing to process the visual data. "Harper?" Mom whispered. "What are you doing here? Did you come to support us?" She thought I was there as a character witness. She thought I had finally come to my senses. "Please, have a seat," I said. My voice was the only steady thing in the room. "Why is she here?" Dad asked Mr. Vance, ignoring me. "I asked for the portfolio manager. I asked for the person holding the note." "Mr. Vance cleared his throat and gestured toward me. "Mr. Rhodes, this is the manager of HR Holdings, LLC, the entity that purchased your debt 2 months ago." My father blinked. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Caleb, then back at me. "You?" he choked out. "You bought the mortgage?" "I hold the controlling interest in the primary mortgage and 100% of the bridge loan," I said, keeping my hands folded on the table. "Technically, I am your lender. Every check you have written for the last 2 months, it went to me." "That is impossible," Mom said, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "You don't have that kind of money. You are just a risk analyst." "I am a very good risk analyst," I corrected. "And I had savings. Savings you didn't know about because I didn't let you spend them on Madeline. I liquidated my portfolio. I took out a loan. I bought the debt because the bank was going to foreclose on you. Mom, you were insolvent." You own our house?" Dad asked, his voice shaking. He slumped into the chair opposite me, looking suddenly very small. "I own the debt secured by the house," I said. "Which brings us to why we are here. I rejected the sale to Jerry because I do not want a co-owner who flips houses. I want the building fixed." "You did this to control us," Dad spat, the shock turning into venom. "You went behind our backs. You stole our property." "I didn't steal anything," I said, leaning forward. "I bought a distressed asset on the open market, and as for control, let's be clear. You used this building to control me. You threatened to make me homeless if I didn't raise your grandchildren. You used my home as a weapon." I opened the file and slid the photos of Mrs. Higgins's moldy ceiling across the table. "But this isn't about me anymore," I said. "This is about Mrs. Higgins. It is about the fire alarm that doesn't work. You are running this building into the ground to pay for Madeline's mistakes. You are putting people in danger. And now, the person you have to answer to isn't a stranger you can charm or a tenant you can bully. It is me." "We are your parents," Mom cried, tears streaming down her face. "How can you do this? How can you sit there and act like a bank?" "Because someone has to be the adult," I said. "You have proven you can't be. You are broke. You are neglecting the property, and you are lying to yourselves. I intervened to stop you from losing everything. If the bank had kept the loan, they would have foreclosed last week when the city inspector filed his report. I am the only reason you still have the keys." "So what now?" Dad asked, looking at his hands. "Are you going to evict us? Throw us out on the street like we threatened you?" The irony hung in the air, thick and heavy. He finally said it. He finally admitted that they had threatened me. I I said. I have the grounds. The default is clear. I looked at Caleb. He nodded slightly. But I am not you, I said. I don't want to hurt you. I want the building fixed. I want the tenants safe. And I want the bleeding to stop. So what is the deal? Dad asked. Looking up, his eyes were tired. The fight had gone out of him. He realized, finally, that the power dynamic had flipped permanently. He wasn't the patriarch anymore. He was a borrower in default. We are going to restructure, I said, but on my terms. My parents sat there, stunned into silence. They looked at the daughter they had tried to mold into a compliant servant, and they saw a stranger who held the deed to their future. They had spent 30 years building an image of a perfect family, but in one afternoon, in a cold conference room, I had shattered the mirror, and for the first time, they were forced to look at the jagged pieces. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the confrontation in the bank conference room began to drain away the moment I stepped out into the cool, gray evening. I did not go home immediately. Instead, I drove to the park along the Maple Bridge River, the same spot where I used to come as a teenager to escape the suffocating perfection of my parents' house. I leaned against the railing, watching the dark water churn against the concrete pilings. The wind was biting, but I welcomed the cold. It made me feel present. For the last 2 months, I had been operating on a high-frequency blend of rage and strategy. I had treated my life like a risk assessment model, calculating variables, mitigating threats, and acquiring leverage. But now, the leverage was absolute. I saw the look on my father's face when he realized I was the one holding the leash. It wasn't just shock. It was fear. For the first time, a question clawed at the back of my throat. Was I going too far? There is a precise moment in every conflict where self-defense transforms into aggression. I had crossed the line from victim to survivor weeks ago. Now, I was teetering on the edge of becoming the aggressor. I had the legal right to foreclose. I had the moral high ground to evict them for their negligence. But destroying them, was that justice? Or was it just the satisfaction of watching the idols fall? I needed a reality check. I needed someone who knew the history but wasn't blinded by the immediate combat. I met Aunt Diane the next morning at a small bakery on the edge of town, a place with mismatched chairs and coffee served in chipped mugs. Diane looked tired. The family gossip mill had been working overtime, and as the neutral party, she had absorbed most of the toxicity. When I laid it all out for her, the ultimatum about the rent, the secret trust documents, the purchase of the debt, and the confrontation at the bank, she didn't gasp. She didn't scold me. She just stared into her coffee cup, stirring it slowly with a metal spoon. I knew they were desperate, Diane said softly, but I didn't know they were cruel, threatening to make you homeless. That is a special kind of low. I had to stop them. Diane, I said, feeling the need to justify myself. They were going to drain me dry. And look at the building. Mrs. Higgins is living with black mold because Dad is funneling maintenance money into Madeline's bad ideas. I am not shocked that you did it, Diane said, finally looking up at me. Her eyes were sad, framed by wrinkles that seemed deeper than they had been a year ago. I am shocked that they pushed you so far that you had to do it. You were always the gentle one. Harper, the peacemaker. The doormat, I corrected. Maybe, she conceded, but now you are the one holding the hammer, and that brings me to the question you need to answer. She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. What is the end game, honey? Do you want to teach them a lesson, or do you want to destroy them? I don't know, I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. Claiming your rights is not revenge, Diane said firmly, but you have the power to take everything they have. If you foreclose, they lose the building. They lose their income. They probably lose their own house eventually. Is that what you want? To see them on the street? I thought about my father's bluster, my mother's manipulation. I thought about the years of being second best. But then I thought about the Christmas mornings before things got bad. I thought about the fact that they were aging. terrified people who had built a cage of expectations and trapped themselves inside it. "No," I said. "I don't want them destitute. I just want them to stop. I want them to stop controlling me. And I want them to stop hurting the tenants." "Then you have to offer them a way out," Diane said. "A hard way out, maybe, but a way out. If you corner a rat, it bites. If you open a door, even a small one, it runs." I left the bakery with a plan forming in my mind. It was a strategy of filtration. I would not execute the nuclear option, but I would dismantle their weapons system. I called Caleb and proposed the terms. "Receivership," I said. "Or something like it. I want to offer them a forbearance agreement. I won't call the loan due. I won't foreclose. But in exchange, they have to surrender the management of the building." "You want to strip them of control," Caleb mused on the other end of the line. "They keep the ownership title, but they lose the keys." "Exactly," I said. "They have to hire a professional property management company, one that I approve. All rent checks go to the management company. The company pays the bills, the taxes, and the repairs first. Then they pay the mortgage note to me. Whatever is left over, if anything, goes to my parents." "They will hate it," Caleb chuckled. "It is a reverse ultimatum. You are telling them they are incompetent." "They are incompetent," I said. "And frankly, they started this war. I am just dictating the terms of the surrender." "I will draft it," Caleb said. "But Harper, be prepared. To them, losing face is worse than losing money. You are taking away their identity as the benevolent landlords." While Caleb was drafting the legal shackles, the emotional fallout arrived at my doorstep. It was Thursday evening when Madeline buzzed my intercom. I almost didn't let her in. I watched her on the grainy black and white screen, shifting her weight from foot to foot, looking nothing like the golden child of our youth. She looked exhausted. I buzzed her up. She walked into my loft and stood awkwardly in the entryway, clutching her purse. She looked around at the exposed brick, the industrial chic furniture, the quiet order of my new life. It was a stark contrast to the chaos I imagined she was living in. "Grant is with the kids," she said, her voice thin. "I had to see you." "Do you want water?" I asked. I didn't offer wine. This wasn't a social call. "I know what you did," she said, ignoring the offer. "Mom and Dad told me you own the mortgage." "I do?" "They are terrified." "Harper," she said, tears pricking her eyes. "Mom can't sleep. Dad just sits in his study staring at the wall. They think you are going to take the building and leave them with nothing." "I might," I said calmly. "It depends on whether they start following the law." "How could you?" she burst out, the tears finally spilling over. "They are our parents, and me. God, Harper, we are drowning. That business failure wiped us out. We needed the help. We needed the money from the building." "I know you were drowning," I said, stepping closer to her. "But Madeline, look at me. You were drowning. So you climbed on top of my head to breathe. You watched them threaten to make me homeless so you could have a free nanny and a cash bailout. You sat on that couch and said nothing." "I was scared," she sobbed. "I didn't want to lose their support. I thought you were strong. I thought you could handle it." "I am strong," I said, my voice dropping to a register of steel. "That is why I am the one standing here owning the building, and you are the one crying in my hallway. But being strong doesn't mean I exist to carry your burdens." Madeline wrapped her arms around herself, shrinking inward. "I never wanted to hurt you. You are 35 years old. Madeline," I said, "you are not a child. If you let Mom and Dad use me to patch up your life, then you are not a victim. You are an accomplice. You are part of the problem." She flinched as if I had slapped her. The room was silent for a long time, save for the hum of the refrigerator. "I don't want my kids to see this," she whispered finally. "I don't want them to grow up thinking love is just a transaction." "Then stop transacting," I said. "Go home. Figure out your own life. Stop taking their money. It is the only way you will ever be free of them." She left 10 minutes later. We didn't hug. But for the first time in our lives, the dynamic had shifted. She didn't look down on me with pity. She looked at me with a terrified sort of respect. The final piece of the puzzle arrived the following Tuesday in a thick cream-colored envelope from the city of Maplebridge. It was a notice of administrative hearing. The complaints I had helped Mrs. Higgins file, combined with the inspector's report and my own anonymous submission, had triggered a mandatory review. The city was tired of sending notices that got ignored. They were convening a hearing to determine if the building should be placed in a municipal receivership program due to chronic negligence and safety violations. The notice listed the interested parties required to appear. Owner of record, Raymond and Linda Rhodes. Secured creditor, HR Holdings LLC. CEO Harper Rhodes. This was it. The private war was going public. This wasn't a mediation room with a soft-spoken referee. This was a city hearing room with a magistrate, a stenographer, and the force of law. I sat at my kitchen island, holding the paper. My parents had received the same notice. They would know that I would be there. They would know that as the creditor, I had the right to speak. I had the right to tell the magistrate that the owners were unfit. I had the right to ask the court to hand the keys directly to me. I realized this was the stage I'd been waiting for. This was the moment I could expose everything. Their greed, their neglect, their manipulation. I could burn their reputation to the ground in front of the city officials, their neighbors, and the tenants. But then Diane's voice echoed in my head. Do you want them to lose everything, or just their control? I picked up my phone and called Caleb. We are going to the hearing, I said. Good, Caleb replied. It is the perfect venue to force the foreclosure. No, I said. We are going to present a third option. We are going to save the building, and we are going to save the tenants. But we are going to make sure my parents never make a decision about a boiler or a rent hike ever again. You are going to show mercy, Caleb said, sounding surprised. No, I said, staring at the river outside my window. Mercy implies forgiveness. I am not forgiving them. I am putting them in a conservatorship of their own making. I am going to end the game, Caleb, and I'm going to make sure everyone sees exactly who won. I put the notice down. My hand was steady. The fear was gone. The guilt was gone. All that was left was the cold, hard clarity of the final move. The hearing took place in room 3 out of 4 of the Maplebridge Municipal Building. It was a windowless room with beige walls and fluorescent lighting that buzzed with a low, headache-inducing hum. It lacked the dramatic mahogany of a criminal courtroom, but the weight of the authority here was undeniable. This was where the city decided who got to keep their property and who had it stripped away. I sat in the second row on the right side, next to Caleb, behind me. I could hear the hushed whispers of the tenants. Mrs. Higgins was there, wearing her Sunday best, clutching a handbag that looked like it had survived 3 decades of hard use. I saw Mr. Henderson, the young man from Unit 2B who worked the night shift, looking tired but determined. They were the silent jury, the people whose health had been gambled away for my sister's organic baby food business. My parents sat at the front table on the left. My father was hunched over, his posture defeated, while my mother sat rigid, staring straight ahead at the empty magistrate's bench. Their lawyer, Marjorie Kane, was shuffling papers with a frantic energy that suggested she knew she was bringing a knife to a gunfight. The hearing officer, a woman named Magistrate Vance, no relation to the banker, entered the room at 9 a.m. sharp. She did not bang a gavel. She simply sat down, adjusted her glasses, and opened the file. We are here regarding the property at 424 Oak Street, Magistrate Vance said, her voice dry. The matter at hand is the petition for administrative receivership due to chronic code violations and failure to cure defects. Let us hear from the Department of Housing. The city inspector stood up. He was concise. He listed the failures like a grocery list of negligence. The fire alarm system was non-functional in 2 zones. There was active water intrusion in the ground floor unit. The rear egress was structurally compromised. He noted that the owners had been given 30 days to fix these issues and had failed to pull a single permit. The building is a hazard, the inspector concluded. It is the city's recommendation that the current owners are financially or operationally incapable of maintaining the safety of the residents. Magistrate Vance turned to my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Rhodes, how do you respond? My father stood up. He cleared his throat, trying to summon the charm that had worked on country club waitresses for 40 years. Your Honor, he began, though that wasn't her title. We are good people. We have owned this building for 15 years. We have just hit a patch of bad luck. The economy is tough. We fully intend to fix everything. We just need a little more time. We were confused about the regulations. We are just a family business. A family business that lets elderly women breathe mold, Magistrate Vance said, cutting him off. Ignorance of the law is not a defense, Mr. Rhodes, and bad luck does not excuse safety violations. She turned her gaze to the other side of the room. I see a representative for the primary lien holder is present. HR Holdings, LLC? Caleb nudged me. I stood up. I could feel my parents' eyes boring into the side of my head, but I didn't look at them. I looked at the magistrate. Good morning, I said. I am Harper Rhodes. I am the managing member of HR Holdings, LLC. We hold the primary mortgage and the bridge loan on the property. You are also the daughter of the owners, are you not? The magistrate asked, glancing at her file. I am, I said clearly, but I am standing here as the creditor who intervened to prevent a foreclosure 2 months ago. I purchased the debt because I became aware that the financial mismanagement of the borrowers was putting the asset and the tenants at risk. I heard a gasp from the back of the room. Mrs. Higgins? She hadn't known. Describe the timeline, Ms. Rhodes, the magistrate commanded. 3 months ago, the owners attempted to increase the rent of a tenant, myself, by 125% in a single day, in an effort to force me into unpaid labor, I stated, keeping my voice clinical. When I vacated the unit in accordance with the law, their cash flow collapsed. Instead of seeking legitimate financing, they illegally raised rents on the remaining tenants and ceased all maintenance. I purchased the debt to secure the property. Since taking over the loan, I have observed no attempt to repair the defects, despite multiple warnings. My mother let out a sob. Marjorie Kane put a hand on her arm to silence her. Ms. Rhodes, the magistrate said, as the creditor, what is your recommendation? Caleb handed me a folder. I opened it. Before I make my recommendation, I said, I would like to enter one document into the record. It was provided to my counsel by the estate of the original owner, my grandmother, Eleanor Vance. I walked to the front and handed the paper to the clerk, then placed a copy on my parents' table. My father looked down at it. It was the original letter of intent my grandmother had written to the trust lawyer, the one my mother had tried to shred years ago but had missed. My grandmother wrote that she was leaving this building to her daughter with one specific condition. I read aloud from my copy. This property is to provide decent, stable housing for working people in Maplebridge. Just as it provided for us, it is not a piggy bank, it is a responsibility. If at any time the family cannot honor that responsibility, the asset should be placed in hands that can. I looked at my parents. My mother's face was ashen. She knew that voice. She knew she had betrayed it. My recommendation, I continued, turning back to the magistrate, is that the court orders an immediate transfer of management. I propose that the owners be stripped of all operational control. I have vetted a third-party management firm, Riverfront Property Solutions. They are ready to take over today. They have a repair schedule that brings the building up to code in 6 weeks. My company, as the lender, will front the capital for repairs, adding it to the principal balance of the loan. And the owners? The magistrate asked. They remain on the title, I said, but they become passive investors. They will receive no income from the property until the debt service and the repair costs are fully satisfied. They will not have keys. They will not speak to tenants. They will simply exist on paper. It was a receivership in all but name. I was turning them into silent partners in their own kingdom. The magistrate looked at my parents. Mr. Rhodes, Mrs. Rhodes, you have 2 choices. You can agree to this stipulation voluntarily, or I can find you in violation today, issue fines totaling $15,000, and the city will seize the building and auction it off to pay the penalties. If that happens, you lose the asset entirely, and you will still owe the debt to your daughter's company." My father looked at Marjorie Kane. She shook her head. There was no way out. The trap I had built was watertight. We agree," my father whispered. "Speak up," the magistrate said. "We agree to the transfer of management," my father said, his voice breaking. "So ordered," the magistrate said, banging a stamp onto the file. "The transition begins immediately." We took a recess while the clerks typed up the final orders. I walked out into the hallway to get some air. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a hollow ache in my chest. I had won. I had saved the building, but I had also just publicly castrated my father. The door to the hearing room opened, and my parents came out. I expected them to keep walking, to ignore me in their shame, but they stopped. My mother's face was streaked with mascara. My father looked red, his hands balled into fists at his sides. "Are you happy?" my father hissed, stepping into my personal space. "You humiliated us, in front of the city, in front of those tenants." "I told the truth," I said, standing my ground. "You destroyed this family," my mother cried, her voice echoing in the tiled corridor. "All because we asked you to help your sister. All because you were too selfish to give a few hours of your time. You took our property, you took our dignity, over babysitting." I looked at them, really looked at them. For 30 years, I had been terrified of disappointing these people. I had shaped my entire personality to fit into the small, convenient box they had built for me. And even now, after everything, they still thought this was about a schedule. They still thought they were the victims of a selfish child. "I did not do this because of the babysitting," I said. My voice was quiet, but it didn't shake. "I did not do this to punish you for asking for help. I did this because you threatened me. You looked me in the eye and told me that my home, my sanctuary, was a weapon you would use to hurt me if I didn't obey you." "We were desperate," Dad shouted. "And now you are safe," I said. "The building is safe. The tenants are safe. The debt is being managed. You are not being punished. Dad, you are being relieved of a burden you were too weak to carry. I didn't destroy the family. I just stopped letting you use me as the cement to hold your cracks together." "Do not expect us to forgive you," Mom spat. "Do not expect to come to Christmas." "I don't," I said. "I really don't." I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I heard Caleb step out of the hearing room behind me, falling into step. We walked out of the municipal building into the bright, blinding sunshine of noon. "It is done," Caleb said. "It is done," I agreed. 3 weeks later, I drove past the building on Oak Street. I didn't stop. I just slowed down enough to see. There was a new sign out front. Managed by Riverfront Property Solutions. 24-hour maintenance. There was a contractor's van in the driveway. A crew was working on the rear porch, replacing the rotted wood with fresh, pressure-treated lumber. Mrs. Higgins was sitting on the front stoop, wearing a cardigan, reading a book. She looked up as my car passed. She didn't wave. I don't think she saw me through the glare on the windshield. But she looked peaceful. She wasn't shivering. That was enough. I drove to the foundry. My loft was quiet. I made a pot of coffee and sat in the velvet armchair by the window, looking out at the river. The water was calm today, a sheet of steel reflecting the industrial skyline. My phone was on the table. It was silent. My parents hadn't called. Madeline hadn't called. The silence wasn't a punishment anymore. It was a prize. I took a sip of the coffee. It was hot and bitter, exactly how I liked it. I wasn't the perfect daughter anymore. I wasn't the dutiful sister. I wasn't the tenant. I was Harper Rhodes. I was the owner of my own debt, the manager of my own risk, and for the first time in my life, the author of my own contract. I watched a barge move slowly down the river, cutting a wake through the water. I didn't know if my parents would ever speak to me again. I didn't know if Madeline would ever forgive me for forcing her to stand on her own 2 feet. but as I watched the sun glint off the water, I realized I didn't need to know. I had rewritten the terms, and the ledger was finally balanced. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on whether you think I went too far or did exactly what was needed. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Lila Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and smash that hype button so we can share this journey with even more people.